Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases recorded in the history of the Smoky Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The small settlement of Hollow Creek, nestled in the eastern foothills of the Smoky Mountains, was barely marked on maps in 1869. What remains of it today is little more than scattered foundation stones and a single crooked chimney, visible only to those who know exactly where to look. Local historians rarely mention it, and those who have studied the region's past tend to gloss over this particular community, perhaps with good reason. According to records from the Sevier County Courthouse, Hollow Creek was established in 1842 by several families seeking isolation from the growing tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Among the original settlers were the Blackwood sisters, Martha and Abigail, who arrived in 1851, apparently unaccompanied by any male relatives, an unusual circumstance for the time. County records indicate they purchased a modest parcel of land using funds from what was described only as family inheritance from Virginia. Martha, the elder at 32 and Abigail 29, quickly established themselves as skilled in the preparation of preserved foods and home remedies. A ledger recovered from the general store in nearby Gatlinburg shows regular purchases of large quantities of salt, sugar, and various herbs by the Blackwood sisters between 1851 and 1869. The sisters maintained a somewhat isolated existence, living in a small cabin approximately 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. The winter of 1869 was particularly harsh in the Smoky Mountains. According to meteorological records preserved at the University of Tennessee, temperatures remained below freezing for nearly 6 consecutive weeks, and snowfall exceeded normal amounts by more than 30 inches. Isolation was common during such winters, and many remote cabins would go months without visitors. It was during this winter that James Hollister, a 46-year-old widower who had relocated to Hollow Creek following the war, disappeared. Hollister had been known to visit the Blackwood sisters occasionally, ostensibly to trade game for their preserved foods. The precise nature of his relationship with the sisters was never clearly established, though local gossip, as recorded in the diary of Sarah McCready, wife of the local mill owner, suggested he had been particularly attentive to Martha. Hollister's absence was not immediately noted. It wasn't until March 1869, when the first thaw allowed for travel between homesteads, that his neighbor, Thomas Whitaker, reported to the local constable that Hollister had not been seen since December. A cursory investigation found Hollister's cabin undisturbed, with firewood stacked neatly and supplies organized as if he had stepped out momentarily. The constable's report, filed on March 18, 1869, indicates that, when questioned, the Blackwood sisters stated they had not seen Hollister since early December, when he had brought them a dressed deer in exchange for jars of preserved fruits. The matter might have ended there, as disappearances were not uncommon in the harsh mountain environment. What we know of Thomas Whitaker comes primarily from land records and military documents. A former Union soldier who had served with the 1st Tennessee Cavalry, Whitaker had moved to the area in 1866, purchasing a small plot approximately 2 miles from the Blackwood property. At 38, he was unmarried and kept largely to himself, though neighbors described him as reliable and forthright. His military records indicate he had served with distinction and had been wounded at the Battle of Nashville in December 1864. The Blackwood sisters' cabin stood in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides and backed by a steep rocky slope to the north. According to survey records filed with the county in 1851, the structure measured 20 feet by 16, with a stone foundation and a root cellar dug into the hillside. A separate smokehouse stood approximately 15 feet from the main cabin. The property also included a small garden plot and a spring-fed well. What transpired next would forever alter the quiet existence of Hollow Creek and etch the Blackwood name into the darkest margins of local history. According to Thomas Whitaker's subsequent statement to authorities, He had been invited to the Blackwood cabin for Sunday dinner in late March. This was unusual, as the sisters rarely entertained, particularly male guests who arrived unaccompanied. Whitaker later recalled that the table had been set with unusual care, with what he described as fine china that seemed out of place in such humble surroundings. The meal, he reported, was notably elaborate for the season's end, when winter stores typically ran low. Cornbread, ham, preserves, and what the sisters identified as venison stew were served. Whitaker noted that the sisters seemed unusually attentive to his enjoyment of the meal, particularly the stew, which Martha repeatedly urged him to consume. Whitaker's account, recorded in the constable's log on April 2, 1869, indicates that he found the sisters' behavior increasingly unsettling as the meal progressed. He observed that Abigail seemed to have difficulty maintaining composure when Martha discussed the preparation of the stew, occasionally excusing herself from the table. Whitaker also noted that when he inquired after Hollister, suggesting they might invite him for a similar meal, the sisters exchanged a glance that Whitaker later described as communicating something unspoken but mutually understood. According to Whitaker's testimony, Martha responded to his inquiry about Hollister with unusual precision. "James has been called away on family matters. A distant cousin in Kentucky, I believe. He mentioned it might be some time before he returns." Whitaker found this curious, as Hollister had previously mentioned, having no living relatives. The weather deteriorated rapidly that evening, and Whitaker reported that the sisters insisted he remain overnight rather than risk the journey home in darkness and sleet. He was provided a small room adjacent to the kitchen, separated only by a thin plank wall. It was from this position that Whitaker claimed to have overheard a conversation between the sisters that would later become central to the investigation. According to Whitaker's sworn statement, he heard Abigail weeping softly, followed by Martha's attempts to calm her. Whitaker reported that Martha said, "He's gone now, and none shall be the wiser." The last of him leaves tomorrow with Whitaker. This was followed by what Whitaker described as a sound of glass clinking, as if in toast. Whitaker further testified that he heard Martha say, "The winter has been long, sister. We did what was necessary, as we have always done. Necessity knows no law in these mountains," to which Abigail reportedly replied, "But he called you by name at the end?" He knew, Martha. He knew what we intended. Martha's response, as recorded in Whitaker's statement, was chilling in its pragmatism. "They all know in the final moment, but by then it matters not. The snow covers all sins, and spring washes away what remains." Whitaker, by his own admission, spent a sleepless night, leaving at first light without breakfast, despite the sisters' apparent insistence that he consume more of the leftover stew. He immediately made his way to the constable's office in Gatlinburg. Constable Robert Jenkins was a man of considerable experience. Having served as a law enforcement officer in Sevier County since 1853, he had developed a reputation for thorough investigation and fair judgment. His official portrait, preserved in the county courthouse, shows a stern-faced man with a full beard and penetrating eyes. Jenkins was 51 in 1869 and had previously investigated 3 murders and numerous disappearances in the region. Jenkins's initial reaction to Whitaker's account was skeptical. His log entry for April 2nd notes, T. Whitaker reports suspicious conversation with J. Hollister, claims Blackwood women may have harmed H. evidence circumstantial. Will investigate to alleviate W.'s concerns. The constable, accompanied by 3 deputized men, Samuel Davis, William Thornton, and Joseph Miller, returned to the Blackwood cabin the following day. What they found has been documented in Jenkins's official report, preserved in the Tennessee State Archives, and sealed until 1963. The cabin appeared ordinary upon initial inspection. The sisters received the men calmly, offering coffee and expressing confusion at the formal nature of the visit. Martha, described in Jenkins' report as composed and articulate, did most of the talking, while Abigail remained seated by the hearth, hands busy with mending, eyes rarely rising to meet our gaze. Jenkins reported conducting a casual conversation for approximately 30 minutes, during which he intentionally mentioned Hollister several times. He noted that while Martha's responses remained consistent with what she had told Whitaker, Abigail's hands stilled at each mention of the man's name, resuming their work only after a moment's pause. It was only when Jenkins requested permission to examine the cellar that Martha's demeanor reportedly changed. According to Jenkins's report, she became unusually still, her face emptied of expression before stating that the cellar door was swollen shut from the winter damp. When the men insisted, Martha produced a key from around her neck. The cellar, accessed via a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, revealed a space approximately 8 feet square, with shelves lining the walls. These shelves contained dozens of jars of preserved fruits, vegetables, and meats, all meticulously labeled in Martha's precise handwriting. Jenkins reported that his attention was drawn to a series of jars on the lowest shelf, labeled simply Winter 1869. These contained what appeared to be preserved meat in a dark liquid. Adjacent to these jars was a leather wallet which, when examined, contained identification papers belonging to James Hollister. According to Deputy Davis's separate statement, Martha offered no resistance when Jenkins discovered the wallet. She merely stated he left it in payment, said he would not be needing it where he was going. Further investigation of the cellar revealed human remains, later identified through dental records as belonging to Hollister. The condition of the remains suggested expert butchery, with the meat carefully removed from the bones, which had been scrubbed clean and stacked neatly in a wooden box. A journal found hidden beneath the floorboards of Martha's bedroom provided the most disturbing evidence. Written in Martha's hand, the journal detailed what she referred to as the necessary harvesting of not only Hollister, but it seemed at least 3 travelers who had sought shelter with the sisters during various winters, dating back to 1854. The journal contained detailed notes on the preservation process, including recipes and observations on which cuts were most suited to extended storage. Perhaps most disturbing was Martha's apparent motivation, revealed in an entry dated December 17, 1869. When the winter stores run low, Providence has always delivered to our door those who would not be missed until spring. The good Lord provides for those who help themselves. Abigail remains weak of constitution, but accepts the necessity of our methods. The winter is long, and the flesh sustains us. Another entry, dated January 3, 1869, read, Hollister proved more difficult than expected. His size was an advantage in terms of yield, but Abigail required assistance in the final stages of preparation. His left thigh has been preserved according to the method that proved successful with the traveler from Ohio in '58. The right we have consumed fresh with the last of the root vegetables. Abigail wept again tonight. Her sensitivity remains a burden, though she ate her portion without complaint. The journal also contained what appeared to be observations on the effects of consuming human flesh. One passage, dated February 10, 1869, stated, We grow stronger as the winter progresses, despite the scarcity of other provisions. There is a certain vitality that comes with this particular sustenance that cannot be obtained from lesser meats. Abigail's cough has subsided entirely, and my own vision seems improved. There is power in the consumption of one's own kind, a transfer of essence that the Church would surely condemn, but which God, in His wisdom, has made available to those with the fortitude to harvest it. The sisters were taken into custody on April 5, 1869. According to Jenkins's report, Martha went willingly, while Abigail had to be physically removed from the cabin, clinging to the doorframe with surprising strength for a woman of her slight build. Jenkins noted that Abigail spoke only once during the arrest, asking if she could bring a particular jar of preserves, a request that was denied. The discovery of the Blackwood sisters' activities sent shock waves through the small communities of the Smoky Mountains. The Gatlinburg Chronicle, in its April 8th edition, reported the arrests under the headline, Monstrous Crime Discovered in Hollow Creek, Sisters Accused of Most Unnatural Acts. The article, while sensational in tone, provided few details, noting only that certain remains had been discovered and that the sisters were being held pending trial. Local reaction, as documented in various diaries and letters from the period, ranged from horror to a strange sort of vindication. Sarah McCready's diary entry for April 9th notes, "It has long been whispered that those women were not as they appeared. All was apart, all was sufficient unto themselves, in a way that is not natural for women alone. Now we know the terrible truth of their self-sufficiency." The Reverend John Thornton of the Gatlinburg Methodist Church reportedly delivered a sermon on April 11th that, while not mentioning the Blackwood sisters by name, warned against the terrible sins that isolation from Christian community can breed in the human heart. Church attendance in the region reportedly increased dramatically in the weeks following the discovery. The sisters were initially held in the Sevier County Jail, but concerns about the possibility of vigilante justice led authorities to transfer them to Knoxville on April 15th. The transfer was conducted in the pre-dawn hours, with the sisters transported in a covered wagon under armed guard. During the journey, according to a statement made by Guard William Thornton, Martha remained silent, while Abigail alternated between weeping and what Thornton described as a strange sort of humming, like a lullaby but with no words. Thornton also reported that at one point, when the wagon stopped to rest the horses, Martha requested that her sister be allowed to walk in the forest for a few minutes. When this request was denied, Martha reportedly smiled and said, "The trees remember us, even if we cannot touch them now." The trial, held in Knoxville due to concerns about local prejudice, began on June 12th and lasted just 3 days. The evidence, including the journal, the remains, and Whitaker's testimony, left little room for doubt. Martha remained eerily composed throughout the proceedings, while Abigail reportedly wept continuously and appeared to be in a state of severe distress. Court transcripts, partially preserved in the Tennessee State Archives, reveal that Martha declined legal representation, choosing instead to speak in her own defense. Her opening statement to the court was brief and unapologetic. "What is done in the deep winter, when snow blocks all paths and the larder grows empty, is between those who do it and their God. The law of men holds no sway over the law of survival." The prosecution, led by District Attorney Edward Livingston, presented the physical evidence methodically. The jars of preserved human flesh, Hollister's personal effects, and the journal were all displayed to the court. Medical examiner Dr. William Harrison testified that the remains found in the cellar were prepared with a level of skill that suggests considerable practice, and that the cutting marks on the bones indicated knowledge of butchery techniques typically applied to livestock. Whitaker's testimony on the second day of the trial provided the narrative framework that the prosecution used to establish premeditation. His account of the dinner, the sisters' behavior, and the overheard conversation painted a picture not of desperate survival cannibalism, but of calculated predation. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Livingston questioned Martha directly about the journal entries. According to the court reporter's notes, the exchange proceeded as follows. Livingston: "Miss Blackwood, in your journal, you refer to the necessary harvesting of Mr. Hollister and others. Can you explain to the court what you meant by this term?" Martha: "It is what it appears to be, sir. In winter, one harvests what is available to ensure survival until spring." Livingston: "And you considered human beings to be a crop for your harvesting?" Martha: "I considered them a resource provided by Providence, no different than the deer that walks into one's sights when the family is hungry." Livingston: "But these were men, Miss Blackwood, not deer." Martha: "In the deepest winter, when the choice is between life and death, such distinctions become academic." Livingston: "You also wrote of a transfer of essence and power gained from consuming human flesh. This suggests something beyond mere survival. Would you care to elaborate?" Martha: "I record my observations as I find them to be. There is a strength that comes with certain foods. Any housewife knows this. Some meals sustain better than others." Livingston: "And you found human flesh particularly sustaining?" Martha: I found it sufficient to our needs. Abigail did not testify in her own defense. Court-appointed physician Dr. James Montgomery examined her on the morning of the second day of the trial and declared her not of sound mind and therefore incapable of understanding the proceedings against her or of assisting in her own defense. In his report to the court, Montgomery described Abigail as alternating between periods of unresponsiveness and acute agitation, and noted that she repeatedly asks for her sister and expresses concern about what will grow in the garden now. The jury, composed entirely of men from Knox County, deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict for both women. Martha Blackwood was sentenced to hang. Abigail, deemed mentally unsound by the court physician, was committed to the Tennessee State Asylum for the Insane in Nashville. The execution of Martha Blackwood took place on July 30, 1869. According to the Knoxville Chronicle's account, her final statement was simply, "The winter was long, and we did what was necessary to survive. Judge not, lest ye be judged." Witnesses reported that Martha walked to the gallows with the steady gait of one approaching a familiar task, and that she arranged her skirts carefully before the noose was placed around her neck. The prison chaplain, Reverend Samuel Green, later wrote in his personal correspondence that Martha had declined religious counsel in her final hours, stating only that God and I have our own understanding. Abigail Blackwood was transported to the Nashville Asylum on June 20, 1869. Admission records describe her as physically frail but surprisingly strong when agitated. Initial examination notes indicate that she spoke rarely and, when she did, frequently referred to her garden and to her sister's recipes. She reportedly asked several times if she might be allowed to work in the asylum's kitchen, a request that was denied. Dr. Frederick Merritt, the asylum's chief physician, made regular notes on Abigail's condition. In an entry dated July 31st, the day after Martha's execution, he wrote, "Patient exhibited no visible reaction when informed of sister's death. Continued arranging and rearranging items on bedside table as if organizing shelves. When pressed for response, stated only, 'Martha is never far.'" Subsequent entries document Abigail's rapid physical decline. By mid-August, she was refusing most food, accepting only water, and occasionally small portions of bread. Staff reported that she would sometimes be found holding the bread to her ear, as if listening to it, before breaking it into precise portions that she would not eat. By September, she had lost considerable weight and was experiencing periods of fever and disorientation. Abigail Blackwood died in the asylum on October 27, 1869. The official cause was listed as failure to thrive, though asylum records indicate she refused all food from the day of her arrival, stating repeatedly that she would not partake of anything not prepared by Martha's hand. Her final coherent words, as recorded by night attendant Mary Sullivan, were, "It's winter again. Martha has lit the stove." No relatives came forward to claim either sister's remains. Martha was buried in an unmarked grave in the Knoxville Prison Cemetery, while Abigail was interred in the asylum's burial ground. In both cases, contemporary accounts note that the officiating clergy kept the services brief and that no community members attended. The Blackwood cabin was burned to the ground by local residents shortly after the trial. County records show that the land was never again claimed or inhabited. A survey map from 1875 labels the area simply as Blackwood Hollow, with no indication of structures or ownership. In the decades following the Blackwood case, Hollow Creek experienced a gradual decline. The 1870 census shows that 3 families had left the area by the end of that year. By 1880, only 2 households remained, both located at a considerable distance from the former Blackwood property. The settlement does not appear at all in the 1890 census, suggesting complete abandonment. Local folklore began to incorporate the Blackwood story almost immediately, though often in forms that diverged significantly from the documented facts. A collection of Appalachian folk tales compiled by William Carter in 1892 includes a story titled The Hungry Sisters, in which 2 women who live alone in the forest are revealed to be witches who entice travelers with offers of food and shelter, only to consume them during the night. Carter notes that versions of this tale were recounted throughout the Smoky Mountain region, with local tellers often claiming that it happened just over the next ridge or to my grandfather's cousin. The academic study of the Blackwood case remained minimal until the mid-20th century. Brief mentions appear in various criminological texts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, typically as footnotes in discussions of female murderers or unusual cases of cannibalism. The first substantial scholarly attention came in 1948, when criminologist Dr. Harold Matthews published a paper titled Survival Cannibalism in Isolated Communities, the Blackwood Case Reconsidered, in the Journal of Criminal Psychology. Matthews argued that the sisters' actions, while undeniably criminal, should be understood within the context of extreme isolation and winter privation. He suggested that Martha Blackwood, in particular, might have developed a survival-at-all-costs mentality during the harsh conditions of the Civil War years, when food shortages were common throughout the region. Matthews also noted the unusual nature of two unmarried women attempting to maintain an independent existence in such a remote location, suggesting that their isolation from community support networks may have contributed to their resort to extreme measures. In 1952, anthropologist Dr. Eleanor Simmons attempted to locate the exact site of the Blackwood cabin as part of a study on isolated Appalachian communities. Her field notes, housed in the University of Tennessee archives, indicate that she discovered what appeared to be the cabin's foundation and chimney remains. Local guides reportedly refused to accompany her to the site or to help with excavations. Dr. Simmons's notes describe finding fragments of glass jars among the ruins, as well as what appeared to be human bone fragments that showed signs of careful cutting. She also reported discovering a small metal box containing a collection of buttons, coins, and what seemed to be personal effects, possibly belonging to the sisters' victims. Perhaps most intriguingly, Simmons described finding a series of unusual markings carved into the stones of the foundation, resembling neither letters nor conventional symbols, but exhibiting a deliberate pattern suggestive of intentional inscription. Simmons's research was abruptly discontinued, and her planned monograph on the Blackwood case was never published. University records indicate only that she took an extended leave of absence in 1953 and never returned to her position. A colleague who visited her home in Knoxville in 1954 reported finding it in a state of ordered abandonment, as if she had left expecting to return shortly. Simmons herself was never located, and she was declared legally dead in 1960. The final entry in Simmons' field journal, dated October 8, 1952, reads, "Return to the site today, despite the growing discomfort I feel there. The markings on the stone seem to shift when viewed from different angles. I've attempted to transcribe them, but my drawings never quite capture what I see. Last night I dreamed of two women standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me through my tent walls. Their faces were indistinct, but I knew them nonetheless. The temperature dropped dramatically around 3 a.m., and I heard what sounded like someone moving about the camp. Investigation revealed nothing, but this morning I found a perfect circle of small white stones had been placed around my tent, though the ground shows no footprints but my own." In 1968, during the construction of a fire access road in what would later become part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, workers uncovered additional remains approximately half a mile from the presumed Blackwood cabin site. These included human bones with similar cutting marks to those described in the original case files and in Dr. Simmons' notes. More significantly, they discovered a metal box containing additional journals, apparently written by Martha Blackwood, and buried some distance from the cabin. These journals, which were briefly examined before being transferred to the state archives and subsequently lost during a facility relocation in 1969, reportedly contained entries suggesting that the sisters' activities extended beyond mere survival cannibalism. One partially transcribed entry allegedly read, "The consumption of another's essence brings more than mere sustenance. There is power in the taking of another's life force, a transference of vitality that Abigail and I have come to rely upon. Each winter brings new strength as we incorporate the essence of others into ourselves. Another fragment, quoted in a memo from park historian Robert Jenkins, no relation to the constable, to the state archivist, stated, "Abigail worries that what we do is sinful, but I have explained to her that it is merely the natural order expressed in its purest form. All creatures consume others to live. We have simply eliminated the intermediaries. The flesh of a deer is merely transformed grass and leaves. The flesh of a man is all that he has consumed in his lifetime, concentrated and refined. In taking it into ourselves, we take in not just one life, but many." Perhaps most disturbing was a passage that Jenkins described as appearing to reference some form of ritual preparation. The method matters. The precise cuts, the draining of fluids, the separation of specific organs, all must be done according to the pattern. Grandmother showed me in dreams after she passed, and I have refined her instructions through practice. When done correctly, the consumption brings not just physical sustenance, but a clarity of mind and a vigor of body that defies the natural decline of age. Abigail and I have not marked our birthdays in years, for they seem increasingly irrelevant. Construction worker Michael Dougherty, who was present when the box was discovered, later told a local newspaper that he and several colleagues experienced unusual health problems in the weeks following the find. Dougherty described persistent nightmares in which he was invited to dinner by two women whose faces kept changing, and reported that he lost his appetite for meat entirely for several months afterward. The road construction was completed in late 1968, but several workers refused to return to the site after the discovery. Project foreman James Wilson noted in his final report that the area experienced an unusual number of equipment failures and unexplained accidents, including 3 broken axles on heavy machinery within a single week, and a small landslide that occurred during clear weather. Local folklore around the Hollow Creek area has evolved to incorporate the Blackwood sisters into various cautionary tales. Hikers in the region occasionally report discovering what appear to be the remains of stone foundations and chimney stacks, though official park maps do not mark any historical settlement in the area believed to have been Hollow Creek. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports, documented as recently as 1965, of hikers or campers being offered shelter during sudden storms by 2 women in outdated dress at a cabin that, upon return visits, cannot be located. These accounts are uniformly dismissed by park rangers as confusion resulting from the stress of exposure or as embellished campfire tales. One such account, recorded by park ranger David Mitchell in 1963, came from a group of college students who had been hiking when an unexpected snowstorm forced them to seek shelter. According to their statement, they were approached by 2 women in long dresses who seemed to appear out of nowhere and who invited them to wait out the storm in our cabin just through the trees. The students reported following the women for what seemed like only a few minutes before arriving at a small cabin with a stone foundation and a smoking chimney. The women allegedly offered the students hot tea and cornbread, but became strangely insistent that they also try a meat stew that was simmering on the stove. One of the students, who identified himself as a vegetarian, declined the stew, at which point the older of the 2 women reportedly became very still and silent while continuing to smile. The students described feeling increasingly uneasy, particularly when they noticed that the women did not seem affected by the cold, despite the cabin being drafty, and not much warmer than outside. When the snow let up slightly, the students made excuses to leave, despite the women's apparent insistence that they should stay until fully dark. They reported that as they left, the younger woman whispered to one of them, "Come back when you're alone. Martha makes the best stew in the mountains." The students claimed that when they attempted to locate the cabin the following day to thank the women, they found no structure in the area where they believed it had been, nor any footprints in the snow other than their own from the previous day's hike. Ranger Mitchell's report notes that the area where the students claimed to have encountered the women was approximately 1 mile from the presumed location of the original Blackwood cabin, in a section of forest that had no record of any structures having been built there. He concluded that the students had likely fabricated the story after becoming lost in the storm, though he did note that they appeared genuinely unsettled by whatever experience they had encountered. The few researchers who have attempted to study the case in depth have met with curious obstacles. Records go missing, local informants become reticent, and electronic equipment reportedly malfunctions with unusual frequency in the vicinity of the presumed cabin site. In 1965, folklorist Dr. Margaret Anderson conducted a series of interviews with elderly residents of communities surrounding the national park, hoping to collect oral histories related to the Blackwood case. Her research notes, preserved in the American Folklore Society archives, indicate that while many interview subjects initially agreed to speak with her, most became reluctant when the specific topic was mentioned. One interview with 93-year-old Eliza Jenkins, granddaughter of Constable Robert Jenkins, was particularly revealing. Jenkins initially stated that her grandfather had spoken of the case only rarely and reluctantly, but had told her that there was more to the Blackwood women than ever came out in court. When pressed for details, Jenkins became visibly uncomfortable and said only, "Grandfather said that Martha Blackwood told him something the day they took her away. Something about how she and her sister would never really die as long as the mountain stood. He never ate meat again after that case. Not a bite until the day he died." The interview was cut short when Jenkins claimed to feel suddenly ill, though Anderson noted that before she left, the elderly woman pressed a small cloth bag into her hand and whispered, "Keep this with you if you go looking for their place. They don't like people disturbing their rest, but they respect the old ways." Anderson reported that the bag contained what appeared to be dried herbs in small bones, possibly from a bird. She placed it in her collection of folk artifacts, but noted that it disappeared from her hotel room that same night, though nothing else was disturbed. Dr. Simmons's final journal entry, dated October 12, 1953, and discovered among her personal effects when her university office was finally cleared in 1961, offers perhaps the most disturbing perspective. "I have come to believe that what the Blackwood sisters practiced went beyond mere survival. The consumption of human flesh was incidental to some darker purpose. I have found references in Martha's writings to a ritual aspect that suggests the sisters believed they were absorbing more than mere calories. I dream of them now standing at the tree line watching. They look no older than in the court sketches from 1869. I will not return to the site. Some histories should remain buried." A footnote to this entry, apparently added later in a shakier hand, reads, "They have found me. I hear them outside speaking my name. They say they have prepared a place for me." In 1969, as part of the Park Service's efforts to document historical sites within the newly expanded boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, photographer Richard Coleman was assigned to capture images of the presumed Blackwood cabin site. His field log, preserved in park archives, notes that he spent 3 days attempting to locate the ruins based on Dr. Simmons's coordinates and local guidance. On the 3rd day, Coleman recorded finding what appeared to be the remains of a stone foundation and chimney stack in a small clearing. He noted that the area was unnaturally quiet and that the usual forest sounds, birds, insects, small animals, seemed entirely absent. Coleman took several photographs of the site and collected soil samples for historical analysis. Upon developing his film, Coleman discovered that every photograph taken at the site showed only undisturbed forest, no clearing, no foundation, no chimney. His field notes and the soil samples stored in his vehicle were found to be missing when he returned to park headquarters. Coleman's report concludes with the terse statement, "Unable to locate or document site. Recommend removal from historical registry." Park records indicate that Coleman resigned his position 2 weeks later and moved to California. A colleague who maintained correspondence with him reported that Coleman refused to discuss the Blackwood assignment and would change the subject whenever it was mentioned. The precise location of the Blackwood cabin site is no longer marked on any official maps of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Ranger training materials from the 1960s, recently declassified, include a brief section advising staff to redirect visitors inquiring about the Cannibal Sisters of Hollow Creek to the park's historical center, where no information on the case is actually available. A supplementary note in the 1968 revision of these materials instructs rangers to report any unusual encounters or visitor reports of women in period dress offering shelter directly to the chief ranger, rather than documenting them in standard incident logs. The note further advises that any personal effects found in the vicinity of the presumed Blackwood site should be left in place and not removed from the area under any circumstances. To this day, some local families in the communities surrounding the national park maintain a curious custom. When preparing traditional cornbread, a small portion is left outside on winter nights. When asked about this practice, older residents typically respond only that it is to keep certain hungers satisfied, or so they won't come looking for more than cornbread. A researcher in the 1980s, attempting to compile a comprehensive history of Sevier County, reported encountering this tradition and inquiring about its origins. In an unpublished manuscript, he recounted an elderly woman's explanation. "My grandmother taught me, and her grandmother taught her. When the snow is deep and the night is cold, you put out the cornbread. Not too close to the house, mind you, just at the edge of the trees. By morning, it's always gone. Might be animals, might be something else. Don't matter what takes it, long as it's taken. The offering keeps old appetites at bay. Some hungers, once awakened, never truly die. The sisters taught us that, though we don't speak their names." The Blackwood case remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of the Smoky Mountains, remarkable not only for its gruesome details, but for the way it has been systematically obscured from official records. Whether this represents a deliberate attempt to distance the region from a disturbing past or something more troubling remains, like so much of this case, shrouded in mystery. In 1960, historian William Harrison attempted to include a chapter on the Blackwood case in his book Forgotten Crimes of the Appalachians. According to his publisher's correspondence, preserved in the University of North Carolina archives, Harrison submitted a complete manuscript that included substantial material on the sisters. The published version, however, contains only a brief paragraph mentioning a case of survival cannibalism in the Smoky Mountains during the winter of 1869, with no specific details or names. Harrison's original manuscript has never been located. In a letter to a colleague dated September 1960, Harrison wrote, "The most peculiar thing has happened. My research notes on the Blackwood case, all of them, have vanished from my study. More disturbing still, I find I cannot recall with any clarity the details I had gathered. It is as if a fog has descended over that portion of my memory. My wife tells me I woke shouting last night about women standing at the foot of our bed, but I have no recollection of any dream." The letter continues, "I have decided to abandon this line of research. Some matters, I have come to believe, resist being committed to paper. Perhaps that is for the best." Dr. Jennifer Lawrence, a forensic anthropologist who examined the bone fragments discovered during the 1968 road construction, published a brief paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 1970. She noted that the cutting marks on the bones were consistent with those made by an exceptionally sharp blade wielded with precise knowledge of human anatomy, and that the bones themselves showed signs of careful preparation, including boiling and scraping to remove all tissue. Most intriguingly, Lawrence reported finding microscopic engravings on several of the bone fragments, visible only under magnification. These consisted of repeating patterns of interconnected spirals and what appear to be stylized representations of human figures. She noted that the engravings did not match any known Native American or European decorative tradition and speculated that they might represent a unique symbolic language developed by the perpetrators. Lawrence's paper was met with skepticism from colleagues. several of whom publicly questioned her methodology and conclusions. She defended her findings vigorously at first, but abruptly withdrew from academics. Debate on the subject in late 1970. University records indicate that she took a leave of absence from her position that same year and did not return. Her current whereabouts are unknown. The bone fragments and other physical evidence from the 1968 discovery were supposedly transferred to the Tennessee State Archives, but do not appear in any current catalog of holdings. Inquiries about these items typically receive the response that they were misplaced during a reorganization of the collection, or may have been returned to the National Park Service, though park records show no such return. In 1975, novelist James Crawford published Hungry Winter, a fictionalized account of the Blackwood case. While the names were changed and certain details altered, the parallels to the historical case were unmistakable. The novel achieved modest commercial success, but went out of print within 2 years despite favorable reviews. Crawford had reportedly conducted extensive research for the book, including visits to the presumed cabin site and interviews with local residents. In a 1977 interview with a small literary journal, he mentioned having gathered far more material than I could use, and hinted at plans for a nonfiction follow-up that would present the historical facts of the case. No such book ever materialized. Crawford's literary agent later reported that the author had abandoned the project after experiencing what he described as a period of intense nightmares and unexplained illness. Crawford himself refused all further interviews on the subject and reportedly destroyed his research notes before moving to Maine, where he ceased writing entirely and lived in relative seclusion until his death in 1992. A curious footnote to Crawford's involvement with the case emerged in 2002, when his daughter discovered a sealed envelope among his effects. Inside was a single page of handwritten text that appeared to be an alternate ending to Hungry Winter that was never published. It read, "The truth of the Blackwood sisters lies not in what they did, but in what they became." The consumption of human flesh was merely the beginning, a gateway to something that transcends ordinary mortality. They understood what the old mountain folk had always known but rarely spoken of, that certain acts, performed with precise intention and in specific places, can bend the very fabric of existence. They are still there, in their hollow, in their cabin that is and is not. The Park Service can redraw its maps, historians can lose their notes, photographers can find their film unexpectedly blank, but the sisters remain. They wait through summer and fall with the patience of those who have transcended time's ordinary constraints. But when winter comes and the snow lies deep, they grow hungry again. Not for flesh alone, but for essence, for life, for the power that comes from consumption. I have seen them, standing at the tree line at dusk, their forms simultaneously substantial and translucent, their faces both young and impossibly ancient. They have seen me in turn. They know I have told their story, or a version of it. They are not displeased. Notoriety serves them in its way, creating a legend that simultaneously reveals and conceals. I leave this record knowing it will likely never see print. Some truths resist being fixed in words, but for those who might follow where I have been, a warning. If you walk the old paths in the Smoky Mountains and come upon a cabin where 2 women offer you shelter from the cold, do not enter. No matter how bitter the wind, no matter how deep the snow, and if you must enter, eat nothing they offer you, especially not the stew. The authenticity of this document has been questioned, with some suggesting it may have been a discarded fictional epilogue rather than Crawford's genuine belief. His daughter, however, has stated that the handwriting changes noticeably toward the end of the text, becoming increasingly erratic, and that the final lines appear to have been written in great haste or agitation. The foundations of Hollow Creek lie buried beneath decades of forest growth. The precise location known to few, but on particularly cold winter nights, when the wind moves through the bare trees of the Smoky Mountains, some hikers report hearing what sounds like 2 women's voices, calling as if to welcome weary travelers to shelter. Park rangers advise all visitors to stick to marked trails and to never, under any circumstances, accept hospitality from strangers encountered in the remote regions of the park after dark. In 2006, a group of paranormal investigators attempted to locate the Blackwood site and conduct what they termed a scientific investigation of reported phenomena in the area. Their permit application was initially approved by park administrators, but was revoked just days before their planned expedition. The official explanation cited environmental concerns and the potential disruption of historically significant sites, though internal memos later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request suggest other considerations. One such memo from the chief ranger to the park superintendent stated, "While I understand the desire to treat this as merely another ghost story, we should remember the pattern of incidents associated with this location. Personnel who have spent time researching or documenting the site have experienced a statistically significant rate of unexplained phenomena, illness, and in 3 cases, disappearance. I strongly recommend maintaining our policy of quiet discouragement regarding this particular site." The investigators appealed the decision, but eventually abandoned their plans when several members of their team reported experiencing vivid nightmares, featuring 2 women in 19th century dress who extended dinner invitations in the weeks leading up to the planned expedition. Local tour guides in Gatlinburg and other towns bordering the national park occasionally include sanitized versions of the Blackwood story in their repertoire of regional folklore, typically presenting it as a campfire tale with no claim to historical accuracy. These versions often transform the sisters into conventional supernatural figures, witches or ghosts, rather than the more disturbing reality of human predators. Park Service employee training materials from 2010, obtained through a records request, reveal a standing policy regarding the Blackwood case and related visitor inquiries. The relevant section states, when visitors inquire about the Cannibal Sisters, Hungry Sisters, or Blackwood case, employees should acknowledge only that various folklore exists regarding 19th century settlers in the region. Specific locations should never be provided, and employees should discourage visitors from attempting to locate sites associated with these stories. Any persistent interest in the exact location should be reported to a supervisor. A supplementary note adds, employees should be aware that GPS devices and other electronic equipment have been reported to malfunction in certain areas of the park's eastern sector. Visitors should be reminded that cell service is unreliable throughout much of the park and that all hikers should carry paper maps and basic survival equipment. Perhaps most tellingly, an internal memo from 2015, inadvertently included in a response to a broader records request, mentions a recurring need to relocate trail markers in Sector E7, with no explanation for the relocations. Sector E7, according to Park Service maps, encompasses the area where the Blackwood cabin is believed to have stood. As we conclude this account, perhaps it's worth considering that some hungers go beyond the physical, and some forms of consumption leave marks not just on the body, but on the very land itself. The sisters who served more than cornbread may be long gone from the physical world as we understand it, but their legacy lingers in the dense forests and deep hollows of the Smoky Mountains, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying predators are those who look just like us, who invite us in from the cold with the promise of a hot meal and a warm bed. The last documented sighting of what some believe to be the Blackwood sisters occurred in February 2019, when a wildlife photographer spending the night in a remote area of the park reported encountering 2 women in old-fashioned, long dresses who approached his campsite during a snowstorm. The women allegedly invited him to a more comfortable place just through the trees, and became insistent when he declined. The photographer, who requested anonymity when reporting the incident, claimed that when he showed the women his satellite phone and mentioned that his wife was expecting his call, they withdrew into the darkness without another word. The photographer reported feeling an overwhelming sense of having narrowly escaped something terrible, and packed up his equipment despite the storm, hiking several miles through the night to reach his vehicle. He later discovered that none of the digital photographs he had taken that evening had been properly recorded, with all files showing as corrupted when he attempted to access them. Park rangers responding to his report found no footprints in the fresh snow around his campsite other than his own. The official incident report concludes, visitor likely experienced mild hypothermia and temporary confusion due to unexpected weather conditions. No evidence of other individuals in the area, and yet local residents continue to leave small offerings of cornbread on winter nights, just at the edge of where their property meets the forest. Just in case, because in these mountains, some stories are more than stories, and some hungers never truly die.